Very warm welcome to Dorset Humanists today. And as I say, I've muted everyone for now, but we'll allow you to speak later on, make a comment or ask a question when we get to the Q&A session. During the talk, it's probably advisable for you to turn off your video as well, to avoid distractions and any possible kind of technical reasons which I don't understand. But if you'd like to turn off your video as well, that's probably helpful, but do feel free to turn your video back on as and when we get to the Q&A session. It's nice to be able to see you and interact. As I've said, some of you have heard already that we are recording this event, so that's another reason, if you don't want to be seen on any recording, another reason for just turning off your video. Please try to avoid using the chat function during the talk itself, and please don't share any personal details. You will, of course, be able to use the chat function during the Q&A session. Our next talk on Zoom is going to be Wednesday, the 27th of February in the evening, 7:30. Jamie Woodhouse is going to be talking to us about sentientism, which may be a new word for some of us. Sentientism is a philosophy that grants degrees of moral consideration to all sentient beings. So that's coming up on Wednesday the 27th. And our next Saturday talk on the 13th of February is when we're going to be celebrating our Darwin Day. And I'm really sorry that this year we won't be able to offer you lunch. You'll have to bring your own. But we do have a special treat in store. Those of you who listen to the Today programme on Radio 4 will recognise the name Adam Minot. Adam was a World Affairs correspondent for the BBC, and he's recently retired, and he has an amateur interest in evolutionary psychology. So that's what he's going to be talking to us about. Please don't forget our winter appeal. All the details are in our latest monthly bulletin. I've sent all of you who had actually RSVP'd on Meetup earlier this morning, I've sent all of you a link to our Just Giving page. But you can find the details in our monthly bulletin. Well, our speaker today is Miguel Farias. Miguel, I believe, is originally from Portugal, and he teaches at Coventry University. He's speaking to us from Oxford today. His book, The Buddha Pill, co-authored with Catherine Wickholm, was first published in 2015, and a new edition came out in 2019. And I believe it caused quite a stir because it includes a chapter on the dark side of meditation. So would you please welcome Miguel in the customary way, and we'll make a start. So Miguel, I'm going to, yes, you're unmuted, that's great. And Miguel, do you want to use the share screen function?
Yes, I'll do that.
You do. Okay, let me allow you to do that then. And then you can get the share screen up. So it should be okay, Miguel, now, if you want to share screen.
Let me see. All right. Yeah, I'll, thank you. I think it works.
That's great. Lovely.
Yes, before I start my talk on meditation, I was asking David to give me some background on your organization. I've spoken before, I think at least once or twice, to Humanists, to some chapters of the Humanist organization in the UK, but not to you, although I've been meaning to for the last 2 or 3 years, I think. So I'm glad that I finally managed to. But the reason I was asking David is for the last few years, while I've been working on meditation, I've also been working on a large project focusing on atheists and agnostics around the world. And so I'm now sharing the page of a report. I've pasted the link in the chat to everyone. This is accessible to everyone. But I really just wanted to share this with you, because one of the things I came across while doing this project, so at a certain point I was doing interviews, so we have both a large quantitative but also some qualitative research, and I was doing some interviews in Brazil, And I felt a bit like an archaeologist stumbling upon something which everyone thought was dead. I stumbled upon the last active church of positivism in the very south of Brazil. So as some of you might be aware, the positivist church was started by Auguste Comte in Paris. And the positivist movement was successful not only in France, but it also had churches. It had at least 4 churches in England. They're all gone except one, I think in Liverpool, which was bought by the Catholic Church and is today still a Roman Catholic Church. But there were also 2 or 3 Brazilian churches of positivism. And if you see this last picture here, so this is the current priest of this Church of Positivism in Brazil. So there are behind him some busts of Auguste Comte, and you can't see the full picture behind him, but it's a painting of the goddess of humanity, who does look a bit like the Virgin Mary, because Auguste Comte was very influenced by the aesthetics of the Roman Catholic Church. So it's a fascinating chapter. Perhaps some other time I'll tell you more about this.
That's really fascinating. Thank you, Miguel. There was a very strong positivist church in London in the 1880s, but it lasted for about 10 or 20 years.
Oh, wonderful. I didn't know that. Oh,
yeah.
I'd love to know more about that. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll move now to meditation. Can you all see the slides?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, brilliant. So this is really a popular science talk on meditation, and I've organized it so that it's structured around some key questions, because there's quite a lot of information on meditation these days. But just to give some of the background, I'm an experimental psychologist. So as David was saying, I'm originally from Lisbon, where I did my undergraduate, and then I moved to Oxford to do my doctorate. And most of my research interest has been focused on various kinds of beliefs, but also practices. And around 2009, I met the person who then led the Prison Phoenix Trust, which is a small charity that organizes yoga and meditation classes across most British prisons. And this is a picture from some of the prisoners doing some yoga postures together. So I started working with them, running a controlled trial of the effects of yoga and meditation. And that's when I started working with Catherine Wickel, who was an expert in prisons and eventually became also a clinical psychologist. And our book, The Buddha Pill, was originally supposed to focus more specifically on the effects of meditation in prisoners, but then it sort of branched out into other aspects as we dug deeper into the literature, which is a fascinating literature. And eventually that work led me in the last few years to put together this other book, which is a rather comprehensive handbook on meditation, which covers from the history of these various techniques to the neuroscience and clinical psychology, and also something about the adverse effects, which I'll tell you a bit about.
Miguel, we're just getting a few messages that people can't see the next slide. I don't know if you can just have another go at moving the slides on.
Okay, so what I will do is I will stop sharing and I will start sharing again.
Okay.
Okay.
That's better, yeah.
Yeah, is that better?
Yeah, thank you.
Right, oh, I see. Right, so as I was saying, I'll structure the talk around 5, somewhat simple questions. The answers aren't necessarily simple, but starting with something very general. Why do we meditate? And for how long have humans been meditating? A more specific question is whether meditation is different from simple physical relaxation. Moving into slightly more esoteric, Does meditation produce a unique state of consciousness, which has been a concern of quite a lot of the research? And finally, can meditation have negative effects? So starting with the first one, why do we meditate? And I've purposely chosen a background image of a rather idyllic image of someone meditating in the middle of a tranquil lake. So we're given this is actually an image which quite a lot of my mindfulness colleagues like to use, and it's of course a stereotype which doesn't really correspond to the truth. I mean, very, very, very rarely there's people meditating in the middle of the lakes, and within the various monastic traditions, it's also very rare. But it's a beautiful image, which is why they use it so often. Now, the reason why people are told these days that they should meditate is because most of the times our minds look like this. They look like a cubist picture. Our minds are fuzzy, are unclear, we're jumping from one thing to the other. And what we're being told by quite a lot of scientists and meditation or mindfulness teachers is that by meditating, our minds will be more similar to that first image I showed you. So there's a whole range of potential benefits that you can get from meditating, from mental and physical health benefits, but potentially also cognitive benefits, an ability to focus more, the idea that it will generally increase your well-being. But there's also a more recent interest in showing that meditation can also improve your pro-social behavior, as psychologists tend to call it. So it might increase your ability to feel empathetic or compassionate towards others. You may also derive some existential benefits in terms of finding more about yourself. And finally, a more spiritual idea that it allows you to experience a special or unique state of consciousness, which within mindfulness is usually spoken of in terms of experiencing pure awareness. And I'll say something more about that later. So my first question, it's a statement, and then I'll ask, the general question is whether this is a fact or a fiction. So I'll read it out. The traditional aim of meditation has never been to achieve physical or mental well-being. This goal is a recent development of meditation in the modern world. So is this a fact or a fiction? So although there has indeed been a tremendous emphasis in the last 50 years in the using meditation in terms of self-enhancement purposes for mental health, cognitive abilities, and physical health, what we find in the traditional meditation literature is quite a broad range of motivations and goals. So, for instance, within Eastern Hindu and Buddhist traditions, you'd find that you meditate to liberate yourself from the cycle of death and rebirth. Within Hinduism, but also within the Abrahamic traditions, you meditate or contemplate to be closer or to feel united with the divine or to save your soul. If you move again towards the Far East, particularly within Taoism, there's not really such a clear sense of self-transcendence in a sort of world-denying way, but more of an achievement of a harmony or a special balance. And both within Taoism and Hinduism, and to a certain extent also in Buddhism, you find other kinds of goals, either very physically oriented, such as the idea that you might achieve physical immortality, or you might be able to develop supernatural powers, such as walking through walls, levitating, things like that. And just to give you an idea that this is actually a discussion that has been around for a very long time. This is a quotation from the Zhuangzi, which is probably the earliest collation of Taoist texts. There is already a criticism of people who are using Taoist meditation techniques for the purpose of nourishing their body and increasing their longevity, instead of trying to attain something beyond that. So the answer to that question is, although it is correct, it is generally correct that within the late 20th century and the 21st century, meditation techniques are mostly being used for self-enhancement, well-being, mental health, and physical benefits. There's also within the traditional literature some hints that the goals vary considerably, including using meditation to achieve a sort of prolonged longevity. Now, my second question is, for how long have humans been meditating? As you're probably aware, although the science of meditation has particularly focused on two techniques, mindfulness and transcendental meditation, which comes respectively from the Theravada Buddhist tradition and the Hindu tradition, there's a wide plurality of meditation practices across all world religious traditions. This is an example of the variety of techniques that you can find. So, within Hinduism, you have things like pranayama, where you use meditation techniques focusing on different kinds of techniques that shape your breathing in a particular way. Ekagrata, which comes up in the first yoga texts, yoga as a form of meditation. Back then, there really weren't all these fancy yoga postures, very dynamic as we find them today. That's, as an aside, that most of those postures, and by most I mean at least 90%, were only developed around the 1920s and 30s in India. But within the original yoga text, Ekagrata is a more passive, focused attention technique. Then you have, still within Hinduism, a variety of tantric techniques, such as kula visualization, associated with the idea of chakras, which has become popular in the West. Within Buddhism, you'll be more familiar with things like shamatha and vipassana. So vipassana is what gives rise to the mindfulness, to the modern mindfulness movement. But there's also quite a lot of visualization techniques, either external or inner imagetic techniques, particularly on meditation on dead bodies, either an actual decaying body or something that you visualize. Just to give then an idea of Taoism, and it's quite interesting how, although some things of Taoism have become well known in the West, such as Tai Chi, Qigong, and traditional Chinese medicine, particularly acupuncture, we know very, very little of the meditative techniques within the Taoist tradition, which are very, very sophisticated and include things which are more passive, such as, starting with inner cultivation methods, which involve breathing and visualization techniques, which then move into more sophisticated things called inner alchemy or neidan, which has a very idiosyncratic understanding of the energies of the human body that you also find in traditional Chinese medicine. Just to give you an idea also of the techniques within the Abrahamic tradition, starting with Judaism. Judaism, because of its traditional emphasis on the Hebrew alphabet, you find some very unique techniques which involve letter permutation, for example, where you visually start exchanging Hebrew letters because they're supposed to have a magical meaning, and eventually they allow you to get closer to God or angelic entity. So in the Merkaba recitation, for example, you learn the names of angels and you recite these until you get into ecstatic states. But the idea is that you're actually approaching these divine entities. Within Christianity, I mean, so closer to us, there's a variety of techniques, from simple recitation, such as prayer of the heart, which you find both in the Orthodox and the Western tradition. Lectio Divina started being developed in the Middle Ages and had all sorts of developments up until the 19th, 20th century. It's more based on text, but also uses a lot of imagination. The divine light contemplation coming from the Orthodox tradition, where you're supposed to meditate, not just meditate, but actually experience the light of God. And this gave rise to all sorts of theological discussions, whether the experience was actually the light of God or a secondary emanation, or just something from the mind, or even the devil. And I won't say so much about the whole discussions, but we should bear in mind that none of the texts which mention these techniques are the kind of self-help books which we find these days. We can't take these for granted. They're really embedded within traditions. And most of the times they don't really give you details of how you're supposed to practice, with some exceptions. There are some exceptions, including in the Islamic tradition, where within the dhikr, for example, which can include recitation, but also techniques which involve breathing and visualization, there are some interesting Sufi texts which are very technical. And still within Islam, you have techniques of meditation which involve focusing on music. And finally, at the very top, we have what is most familiar to us all, either the mindfulness-based interventions, transcendental meditation, or relaxation. And I'm sorry to have taken a bit of time, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of the variety of these techniques across traditions. Now, as to whether this is fact or fiction, there is historical evidence that meditation techniques have been used for at least 15,000 years. Is this fact or fiction? So, what we know is that before the emergence of these historical religions, we have what we generally called shamanic practices, which are usually ecstatic practices, mostly relying on dance and singing, so that you enter into a particular ecstatic state, and then the shaman travels into a particular world and communicates with spirits. So there is a break in terms of these early traditions and what we find then in the religious traditions. The earlier text we find, which give us a sense of something like recitation or even passive concentration, comes from the Hindu tradition, and they're about 3,000 years old. So in that sense, we cannot say that meditation practices in the sense of something that you sit down and you focus either on an image or your breath or your flow of consciousness. There simply is no evidence that this has been happening for more than the last at most 4,000 years. After the Hindu texts, the earliest ones are the Taoist texts, which I mentioned. Right, so moving to the third question, and I'll start here speaking about some of the meditation scientific literature which was developed within the last roughly 50 years. So is meditation different from physical relaxation? So in the book, the Buddha Pill, we say that the first wave of meditation started really in 1970. Before 1970, you do find some studies, a few studies, but most of the times they're focused on specific, special individuals, such as yogis, and these stretch back to the 1930s. But it's only with 1970 when transcendental meditation has become popular, particularly in the US and the UK, with the young generation, that you start having, I mean, a wide number of people who aren't meditation experts, but they have been doing this technique for 3, 6 months or 1 or 2 years. And the article which marks the beginning of this literature, so right now, 51 years now, we're in 2021, was originally published in the journal Science, looking at the physiological effects of transcendental meditation. And back then, the emphasis was very much on trying to show that these meditation techniques did change your physiology. And it was only slightly later that they ventured into psychological correlates. And there is a sort of prehistory to this. So just to give you an idea, within the first 7 years, transcendental meditation, I mean, they basically had some of the people who became important in the mindfulness movement, such as Richard Davidson, a well-known neuroscientist. They had these people looking at various physiological effects, such as hypertension, stress, asthma, insomnia, and only then they moved into things like personality traits. Now, there is a prehistory to this interest in using what we also sometimes call mind-body techniques. So meditation is part of a large package of mind-body techniques, which includes things like yoga, Tai Chi, and relaxation methods. So this book by Edmund Jacobson, which became a bestseller, is the first attempt we know to get hold of various techniques which were embedded within a larger spiritual framework, both Eastern and Western. So some of these relaxation techniques are written about by someone like William James, who was very interested in these techniques. So in the late 19th century. And from the late 19th century up until the late 1920s, these became very, very popular, these relaxation techniques. And they mostly consisted of meditation techniques very focused on the body and the breathing. So what happens with this book is that Jacobson got hold of these techniques, and he claims that he got rid of the spiritual component and made it thoroughly secular. Notice the subtitle, the subtle subtitle of this: Practical Methods for Reducing the Tensions of Modern Living. So this is 1934. Think that the word stress only came into common usage after the 1950s. But what he was hinting at with this book is very much what, I mean, our concern. So this concern for the tension of modern living, what we now call stress, has been around for about 100 years as the kind of the malaise of our industrial, well, these days post-industrial world. So these methods are still very popular and were made even more popular with a follow-up best-selling book by Herbert Benson, a medical doctor at the Harvard Medical School, The Relaxation Response. And these techniques were widespread. I was only made aware of this a few years ago. There's someone who's been doing some wonderful work looking at how these techniques were used in Europe, particularly in England. So here we have a photograph of women who were being taught physical relaxation techniques in preparation for giving birth. So this is in 1950 in England. And last but not least, these relaxation techniques have been used by psychotherapy for a while. They're part of the package of cognitive behavior therapy. So here is one of the founding fathers of cognitive behavior therapy saying that he recommends Jacobson's relaxation methods like he recommends other meditation techniques, as a palliative or distraction. So, but he doesn't advise it to take it too seriously or view it as a general therapeutic method. So in his best-selling book, The Relaxation Response, Herbert Benson explained that the positive effects that meditation relaxation techniques achieved were identical. Is this fact or fiction? So there is a small interesting story anecdote around this. Although Herbert Benson was one of the first researchers to publish work on the positive physiological effects of transcendental meditation, a few years later, when he published this book, he did say that meditation and relaxation techniques did lead to identical results, and they were just part of the same package. And this is still an ongoing discussion within meditation research, to what an extent physical relaxation techniques are different from the effects of meditation. There are some studies showing that there are some differences. There are others showing that there aren't. Moving to question 4. Does meditation produce a unique state of consciousness, such as pure awareness? And this is an interesting question, which is implicit in quite a lot of the scientific literature, although very often it's not mentioned explicitly. But to start with an example on how sometimes it is explicitly stated, Kabat-Zinn, the founding father of the mindfulness-based interventions. So he says in an article published in 2017, just so it is clear what I mean when I use the word mindfulness, I'm using it as a synonym for awareness or pure awareness. And in other writings, he makes clear that that it is this state of consciousness that has all sorts of potentials to not just change individuals, but change society. Now, this discussion has been going on for a while. So in the first article, I've already mentioned that the Transcendental Meditation Movement publishes in 1970. There is in the concluding statement that this technique can produce a state of consciousness which is distinct from wakefulness, sleep, and hypnosis. So basically, this is what they call a fourth and unique state of consciousness. Eventually, these experimental results were refuted when they tried to replicate this 7 years later. And the journal Science again produces a replication where they did not find these results. Now, just to give you a bit of a background in terms of where the word mindfulness comes from. So usually my mindfulness colleagues say that mindfulness comes from sati in Pali, which means, they usually say it means pure awareness. So it's true that it comes from sati in Pali. Originally, however, it comes from smriti in Sanskrit, and what it means both in the smriti, in the Sanskrit smriti, but also in Pali sati, it doesn't mean bare awareness. It actually means to remember or to recollect. And what historians think is that this was possibly associated with practices of recollection of the Buddha, either through chanting or visualizing the Buddha. So it's only much more recently, I mean specifically in a book from the 1950s, which became a bestseller, that a German Buddhist monk from the Theravada tradition, which is where Kabat-Zinn learned about these techniques, that he popularized the term sati as bare attention. And what he was doing this because he had a very clear aim of translating these Buddhist meditation techniques as a kind of science of the mind, not really as a religious technique, but as a science technique. And this has been going on for a while. There is a history to this which starts in the late 19th century in Burma, when some Buddhist Theravada monks, as a form of acting against the efforts of British Christian missionaries, they realized that they need to revamp Buddhism for the laity as a less of a religious technique and more of a scientific technique. So it's within this Theravada movement that then you find this retranslation of Smriti as bare attention, and with an effort of really conveying this as a science of the mind and not really as a religion, which is historically incorrect. Really, Buddhism is a religion, and most Buddhists, really the overwhelming majority of Buddhists in Eastern countries, typically they do not meditate, they pray to the Buddha. Now, let's move into the science of meditation to try to answer this question. Can we find this unique state of consciousness by meditating? For example, we find unique neural correlates of meditation. So there's not quite a lot of brain imaging studies of meditation. And what emerges most clearly from these studies is that various meditation techniques recruit different areas of the brain, depending on whether they're focusing on words such as mantra recitation, or they're focusing on an image, or they're just paying attention to the flow of consciousness, mindfulness, which is here named open monitoring, or whether they're focusing on specific positive emotions, such as loving kindness and compassion. So you see here various different recruitments. The only commonality between these various techniques in terms of brain recruitment is here on the lower or the bottom left hand, where you see a recruitment of various areas of the anterior and the mid insula. And what we know from the neuroscience literature on brain imaging is that these areas are usually associated with interoception, which means our awareness of internal processes, such as the breathing or the heart beating, which makes sense if you think that usually all of these meditation techniques, they start by making you focus on your body, and particularly the breath. So it does make sense that you find this commonality amongst the various techniques in terms of this interoception, this awareness of inner bodily processes. Now, what about the mind? Can meditation benefit our mental health in a unique way? So we're still looking here for a unique state of consciousness that might explain mental health benefits, for example. And here again, we have a vast literature, and there's individual studies, but there's also now various meta-analyses looking at both physical and mental health factors. I usually focus on one or two major meta-analyses which are not just robust, but they pick up the better quality studies. So the best one we find is from 2014, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association Internal Medicine. And here again, what I'd like to highlight is that there are various levels of evidence for the benefits of meditation programs. So although we have moderate evidence, and think that there are various levels. So there is no evidence, there is low evidence, there is moderate evidence, and there is strong evidence. So the strongest evidence we find in these programs is a moderate evidence for improved levels of anxiety and depression and pain as well. However, there is low evidence of improved stress. And this is somewhat unexpected. Think that the first major mindfulness program is precisely called mindfulness-based stress reduction. But there's only low evidence for that these mindfulness techniques lead to improved stress. On the other hand, there is just no effect or no evidence that these programs have any positive effects on mood, attention, substance use, eating habits, sleep, and weight. Finally, when you contrast these meditation programs, even the ones that have moderate evidence against other kinds of intervention, whether it's psychotherapy, pharmacology, or just physical exercise, which also has some very good effects for things like depression, we really find no evidence that these meditation programs are better than any of these active treatments. So here we also do not find any unique effects of meditation. So the fourth statement I have for you: many philosophical and religious traditions teach that happiness is to be found by living in the moment, and practitioners are trained to resist mind wandering and to be here now. So again, implicitly the idea that these traditions specifically teach you something rather unique, to be here in the now, basically to be mindful in the way that this Theravada Buddhist tradition tells us in the Western world. So this is actually, I think, of all the questions, is the most straightforward to reply to. This is fiction, of course, although it was published in the journal Science. There you go. And everyone who does A-levels on religious studies would know that most religious traditions, and Buddhism would not be an exception, are not really interested in the here and now. This seems to be more of an obsession of our modern age. But although, I mean, meditation techniques obviously are teaching you to be aware of what's happening now, that's really just a channel to move into something beyond the here and now. And religious traditions are typically much more concerned about the past and the future, not really the here and now. So finally, and when David was introducing me, he did mention quite rightly that our book, when it came out in 2015, did have, I mean, a bit of media repercussion because it had a chapter on the potential negative effects of meditation. Something which I wasn't aware of, actually, when we started writing this book. So I'll start with a statement this time. Over 40 years ago, the American Psychiatric Association recommended that research into meditation had to consider its usefulness as well as its dangers. So I've only found this statement much later than by the time we published the book, about 2 or 3 years ago, and this is a fact. So the American Psychiatric Association did produce a report where it suggested this in 1977. And here is the original statement, that meditation should be all forms, well-controlled studies to evaluate the possible specific usefulness, indications, contraindications, and dangers of meditation techniques. Now, just to give you a bit of background, it's not just in terms of mental health that meditation has a history of being used in ways which, I mean, these days we might not consider overall positive. For example, the historian Brian Victoria, who is himself a practicing Buddhist priest, has done quite a bit of work showing how during the Second World War, the Japanese military were using Buddhist techniques and ideas to depersonalize the soldiers so that they would just go forth and sacrifice themselves, not feeling worried about giving their lives for the military cause, which was seen, I mean, generally by the country as a sacred or holy war. The other thing which very few people are aware of is that this is not a recent discussion. The idea that meditation techniques may lead to adverse effects has been discussed for a while, and the first record we find of this goes back to the 5th century Common Era, or in one Buddhist scripture, there are clear, it's clearly reported that if meditation isn't carried out in a certain way, it can lead to all sorts of unexpected negative events, such as the mind becoming restless, confused, and the meditator feeling, basically depressed in the way it depicts what may happen to the meditator. But this isn't just happening within the Buddhist tradition. Within the Hindu tradition, you have all sorts of warnings, including the possibility of becoming psychotic by using certain techniques. And within the Christian and Islamic traditions, there's also writings mentioning the possibility of difficulties. Now, there are discussions, of course, about whether these difficulties are just part of the journey, as some say, or not. They're things which can be avoided. So, for instance, within the Christian idea of the dark night of the soul, this does seem to be something which is eventually leading to a greater spiritual good. However, people can get stuck in it, which isn't necessarily a good outcome. Within the Islamic context, there's a possibility also that you get stuck, and the meditation technique can be counterproductive. And within the Buddhist tradition, it's very, very clear that these effects are understood as a sickness and something which should altogether be avoided and necessary, and certainly not something which is ultimately good for you to experience. Now, as I was saying, I wasn't aware of this when I first started looking into meditation. I first became aware of it through a student who had been a yoga and meditation teacher. And one day she was doing an intensive meditation retreat, and she had an acute psychotic episode, which then led to a chronic deep depression. And it took her over a decade to get through to the other side. She went back to meditation, is currently a practicing Buddhist, and has put together this web page, Meditating in Safety, which I think it's a very interesting, positive resource. It does have episodes, narratives from people who have experienced some of these negative effects in somewhat extreme ways, including her own. It mentions some of the current scientific literature on this, and also ways to try to avoid these potential problems. Just to mention briefly that there is a short 30-minute documentary on BBC Radio 4 called Mindfulness and Madness, which I helped produce, and it gives an idea of the science, but also it has some very interesting narratives from a couple of people who experienced somewhat extreme episodes after meditation retreats. Now, one question which is interesting, and only recently we've been able to address, is how common are these adverse effects? So about in August last year, my group published a systematic review of the literature from the last 50 years. And overall, we found that the total prevalence of these adverse events was of around 8%. And this is higher than what other literature, particularly some of the mindfulness literature, suggested a few years ago, that it would be much lower, of around 1%. However, this kind of percentage is within what is reported for the potential adverse effects of general psychotherapy practices, which is usually recorded to be between 5 and 10%. So it's nothing extraordinary if it's around 8%. And to give you a more specific idea, what are the most common types of meditation adverse events? So the most common by far have to do with experiencing levels of anxiety and depression. On the least common episodes would be things like dissociation or depersonalization or gastrointestinal problems and suicidal behavior. But what is interesting is that you do find, I mean, a wide variety of potential adverse events. I mean, it's still, there's still quite a lot of research to be done in this. We're unclear at this stage what may be driving this, whether it's the particular context, whether it has to do with the meditation teacher. And something which is particularly worrying is that most, I mean, you don't need, it's there, meditation teaching is not regulated. So there's 1,000 schools of meditation. You don't need to have any awareness of mental health problems. And most of these teachers out there, they actually are not aware of the potential adverse effects associated with meditation. That is the worrying part. One thing which has been discussed for a while is whether the individual is to be blamed for this, meaning whether this has to do with an individual's vulnerability or psychological fragility. Now, within this the systematic review, which is freely available online, I should mention, what we found out is that although most of the studies do not include data on whether these individuals had mental health history, the case studies, so there's also literature on case studies, which we summarize. The case studies generally mention whether these people have mental health problems, and more than half, more than 50% of them did not. So that does give us a sense that potentially these adverse events can happen to individuals who do not have any such mental health problems or past history of mental health vulnerabilities. But I would like to turn this around a bit and say that there's actually there's a potential bright side to this dark side of meditation. And I mean, here I remember Jung and Jung's theory, in which he says that if we're not aware of our shadow side, then, I mean, we really cannot be whole. So there's potentially something interesting, worthwhile investigating in why these episodes might come about. It's not something necessarily bad. It can actually challenge psychologists to think in deeper and more holistic terms about how the mind works. And in that sense, something which quite a lot of my colleagues are saying about how the mind works and how mindfulness might make your mind more fit. This is probably simply a bad or even wrong model of the mind. So my colleague who currently leads the Oxford Mindfulness Center likes to say that just as brushing your teeth or going for a run are well-known ways of protecting general physical health, mindfulness exercise develop mental fitness and resilience. So, I mean, this is intuitively, we like this. This is something which I suppose just the way we have been educated likes this idea that it's like we can improve in maths, our mind can become stronger or more elastic by doing meditation. However, what this literature on the adverse effects is telling us is that this kind of model of the mind, it's actually really, really simplistic. In a way, I find it's astonishing that professional psychology academics are coming up with these simplistic models, and they're very, very rarely challenged about how exactly does the mind work like a muscle. Can you please tell me that, Professor? Can you give us some more insights on this? And we can't, because there's actually very, very few of us, like, psychologists, writing about how the mind works, and there's really no consensus in this. And finally, perhaps this gives us reason to reconsider other models of the mind. I mean, starting, of course, with the famous psychoanalytical model, in which the unconscious is the drive for quite a lot of our motivations and actions, and we're generally aware of this. But within these meditation traditions, there's some very sophisticated models. So here in the middle figure is from Taoism, whereas this somewhat esoteric, but I mean very technical and well-detailed model of how our organs and mind might work. And of course, within the Hindu tradition, there's also a rather sophisticated understanding, and I mean various understanding, a plural understanding of how the mind might work. I'd just like to end up by mentioning the institutionalization of mindfulness. Some years ago, goodness, it's now over 5 years ago, that this report was released in the Parliament. I was invited for it. It was a very, very interesting event, which started with a meditation, very much like within a religious movement, it would have started with a prayer. And then you had this group of school children in their uniforms telling us about the wonders of the Lord. I'm sorry, about the wonders of mindfulness. And it had a preface by Kabat-Zinn telling us about how mindfulness was going to change the course of human evolution. I mean, so for anyone who is aware of the sociology of new religious movements, I mean, it was quite stunning to see the similarities between a new religious movement and this institutionalization of mindfulness. And of course, I will not explore this today, but I thought that it would be of interest to mention the wider societal context of why has this become so popular now. And I mean, think that in a country like the United Kingdom, right now, over half of the population claims to not be religious. And one interesting possibility to explore is when God exits, we leave the door open to other sorts of ideas and beliefs, such as mindfulness, which, although some claim to be secularized, and in a way it has been thoroughly adapted to Western ideas, on the other hand, it clearly retains a sense of metaphysical self-transcendence, particularly within the idea of pure awareness. And of course, because it has made it into widestream popular culture, I mean, you can now even find them. What is it? There is this wonderful collection. I forget now. You will tell me in a minute. This collection of books, and they have now one on mindfulness. This is just one of the vignettes in which this person is exercising mindfulness by swimming. Soon he's aware of himself, no longer worried about money, work, family, or whether he left the faucet on. Many home insurance policies now cover acts of mindfulness, we are told. Thank you very much for listening to me. Just to let you know that if you want to learn more about this, the Oxford Handbook of Meditation will only come out in print next year, but the Buddha Pill wasn't, I think it's still available as an audiobook for free on Amazon. And if you look in my website, you can find all sorts of articles, some more academic, but others more popular science, which may be of interest. Thank you very much for listening to me. Let me just stop sharing this.
Thank you very much, Miguel. That was fascinating, and well done for coming in on time there as well. Okay, well, people might want to just turn their videos back on.
Yes, Ladybird Books. Yes, thank you for that. Yes, exactly.
And we'll start taking some questions. There are various ways of asking a question. If you put your hand up, I might not see you, but I'll try and see you if you do that. You can use a blue hand symbol by going to, I think it's participants and raise blue hand, or you can put a question or a comment in chat and we'll try and cover those as well. So Richard Schofield, I think, is first up. Richard, what's your question for Miguel? Would you like to unmute yourself, Richard?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, thanks for the talk, Miguel, first of all. I wanted to ask a kind of probably an overlap question, really. Does your research take into, or does your research include looking into kind of like self-hypnosis, spontaneous states like oceanic states, immersive sort of states? Because those are sort of things that I don't actively meditate, but I do sort of experience those kind of states spontaneously. Let's say I'm staring out of a window, or if I'm making music or art. And people talk about even watching television, you can enter a sort of self-hypnotic state just watching television. So does your research actually cross over into things that might be comparative to meditative states, possibly?
That's an excellent question. And the answer is no, for one simple reason. It's very artificial, but as it happens, there is a whole separate field on hypnosis and self-hypnosis. And it doesn't really overlap with meditation in terms of how the areas have developed. I mean, and again, I think it mostly has to do with the problem of separating relaxation from meditation. People are carving out their own academic niches, and they want to be able to say that this is something on its own, and it's different from that and that. I would completely agree that in terms of state of consciousness, there are clear overlaps between states derived from meditation techniques and self-hypnosis. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. And Bronwyn, you were next with a question or a comment.
Hi, Miguel. Thanks for the talk. I was interested, was your research more focused on mindfulness, which is quite different from meditation? I myself has studied mindfulness, and I'm currently studying under an enlightened guru in India who teaches meditation from a tradition of 5,000 years or more, and they are quite different in their purpose. Right.
Can you just very briefly give us a bit of background to what school is this?
This is under the guru from the Traditional Yoga Foundation, Dr. Kumar.
Right.
And his teachings of Patanjali, and the pure, I suppose, the pure basis of the meditation is for purification, enlightenment, and releasing the mind from what they call chitta, which is all the monkey jumping around that we have. So that's quite different. The mindfulness, having done the mindfulness, it gives you a sense of awareness, but doesn't take you on that meditation path. So I just wondered, I was confused with your talk where it seemed like your research had done more on mindfulness than on pure meditation.
So that was what I was trying to understand. What would be the difference between meditation and mindfulness? So technically, mindfulness is a technique derived mostly from Theravada Buddhism. I mean, Vipassana. Although, I mean, it's a technique you get also across other branches, other schools of Buddhist meditation. So in that sense, mindfulness is a technique of meditation where its specificity is that you're focusing on the flow of awareness rather than on an object or a mantra. However, some psychologists also like to treat this as a psychological or cognitive ability, that it's not necessarily a meditation technique, but just a cognitive state of awareness, of paying attention in a particular way. So a non-judgmental awareness. I think that's, I mean, that's fine. I mean, psychologists can find ways of measuring almost anything, including, I mean, including silly things. I mean, we're professional in terms of developing scales that can measure anything. Some are real, some are just artifacts or reifications. But what I was talking about, so I was mentioning mindfulness not as a psychological trait or ability, but as a meditation technique.
Okay.
If to answer directly your question.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Miguel, can I take you back to, well, one of your slides was about the meta-analysis of various studies of the effectiveness of, I'm not sure whether it was mindfulness or meditation or both, but the evidence seemed quite weak. Some of the evidence seemed to be suggesting there was moderately positive evidence for beneficial effects, and some of the evidence seemed to be no effect. I wondered what your conclusions were from the evidence, whether there really isn't much evidence for its beneficial effect.
So just to give you a clear idea, in terms of the NHS health guidelines, the thing which, for instance, mindfulness is recommended for is for people who have had recurrent episodes, at least 2 episodes of recurrent depression. And I think that mindfulness has such good results in that respect, because it was specifically developed by people who were leading experts on the treatment of recurrent depression. People like Mark Williams, who was at Oxford, now retired. So they developed, again, based on Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness model, they developed their own package of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And this seems to be, again, moderately effective for people who have had recurrent depression. Again, there's also some interesting results with anxiety. And here again, it varies. People who benefit most in terms of anxiety are those who have high levels of anxiety. So if you have low average levels of anxiety, it wouldn't be as beneficial as if you have high levels of anxiety, which is interesting. So the evidence is quite nuanced. And I think one of the reasons why we hear so much about this is just because it's in the zeitgeist it's in the popular media, and it's also because it's a relatively cheap technique, which, I mean, in terms of a health organization like the NHS, you give this out as a group therapy. I mean, you can also use web-based formats to teach people. And we know that, I mean, even in terms of cognitive behavior therapy, that interventions via the web can be effective, or they're better than nothing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any other questions bubbling up from anyone? I may not, if you raise your hand, I can't see everyone on the screen at the same time.
Yes,
but...
I've got my hand raised, David.
Okay, Sue. Yeah, go ahead, Sue.
Thanks. Hi, Miguel. I wanted to ask you a bit more about Jon Kabat-Zinn, because for those who don't know, he was originally a Buddhist monk, I believe, and then he became, I think, a medical doctor. And I think he's based in somewhere in Boston, can't remember where, but he's been obviously researching mindfulness in a scientific medical context, mostly, I believe, with pain relief for at least 20 years. So what I'm thinking is that he must have a great deal of scientific evidence, research, one way or another. So the research that you cited with 55 participants seems to me a very small sample compared with the research that Jon Kabat-Zinn must have done over the years. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about Kabat-Zinn, and you seem not to be too happy with his work. So I'm wondering what you think of that body of research that he's put together.
Oh, right.
Mostly about pain. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was originally to use mindfulness to reduce pain. And that research is usually quite good in terms of being able to measure the outcomes.
Yeah. So just to briefly correct you, I think you're mentioning a study. It wasn't 55 participants, but 55 studies.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I must have misread. Sorry.
That I think that was the one on adverse effects.
That was the one that had roughly 8%.
Yes, that was the one on potential adverse events. Yes.
Very high statistic, seems to me.
Yeah, but as I said, it's within the range of what you find in terms of adverse events of people who do, I mean, all sorts of psychotherapy practice, which we usually think is good. And it is generally good. There's no doubt about that. I'm all in favor of psychotherapy. I sometimes have to remind people of this because they start to think that I'm in favor of pharmacological therapies, and no, quite the opposite. And
yeah, I'm interested in your expert opinion on the research of John Kabat-Zinn.
Yeah, sure. I'll just to further add to that, I started out as a psychotherapist. I trained in psychotherapy, and the only reason why I stopped, I was very young, and I had the insight that this was really, really tough to do this properly, and I shouldn't be doing it. I was too young and immature to be looking after other people's inner psyche. Now, going back to Kabat-Zinn. Kabat-Zinn is a fascinating case. And I mean, he's become a world-known figure. And within Western Buddhism, there's no doubt that practicing Western Buddhists think of him as a bodhisattva, meaning that he's a spiritually enlightened person. Now, Kabat-Zinn is academically actually a molecular biologist. He's a molecular biologist who, like quite a lot of other people in the 1970s, including Richard Davidson, who became a major neuroscience in the study of meditation, he was interested in all sorts of, what we then called, and he himself called, New Age spiritual practices. There is a fascinating article from 5-6 years ago where Kabat-Zinn reflects upon his religious experience, in which he saw himself develop. So after a Vipassana retreat, so this is a 10-day meditation retreat, mostly a silent retreat, he had this short religious experience where he saw himself coming up with an adaptation of Buddhist meditation and the other things. So his package of mindfulness meditation includes not just the Theravada Buddhist techniques, but some stuff from yoga, some stuff from Zen Buddhism as well. I mean, as he himself admitted, it was very much a New Age package. So he saw himself come up with this package, and it became popular. But then, as he also rightly reflects further in the article, by the 1990s, what used to be New Age stuff had become mainstream. And it was also in the 1990s that his mindfulness model, so he started, you're quite right, he started using this with chronic pain patients. And there's an early video, a documentary of him, relatively young, I suppose in his 40s, very charismatic, talking to some of these people who are using meditation techniques to treat chronic depression. And he's approaching meditation saying things like, we've taken this out of the monasteries. This is no longer out there in the mountains, but it's now accessible to the truck driver, to the nurse, to the housewife. Very, very charismatic. Well, as a matter of fact, the technique had been taken out of the monasteries, a long time before he did. So he already adapted something which had gone through almost 100 years of permutations, both in the East and then in the West. What the problems I have with Kabat-Zinn, so his research per se is not the most significant research in terms of the clinical findings. He's the originator, so there is something creative in the sense that he was the first person to put together this package that of mindfulness-based therapy, and this was then picked up by other people like Mark Williams in the 1990s, who was himself also interested in Vipassana meditation. So I think we have to recognize that there was something very creative and and beneficial. He did want this to be used for very wide therapeutic practices, but the hard science is actually, and the relevant clinical trials are, although he published some stuff on it, the better science is done by other people, not by Kabat-Zinn himself, who has been since then a charismatic figure. The problem I have is that this has become a political movement, and he himself, for the past 10 years, he's been trying to advance a political agenda where mindfulness becomes a sort of new LSD. Think of Timothy Leary. He was trying to do something very similar in the 60s. He had the idea that if you only gave access to LSD to political leaders, this would lead them to have a specific altered state of consciousness that would lead them to see reality in a different way, and this would lead to a different world. So I think he's still under that Timothy Leary effect, having been brought up in that same age. And he's not being very, I'm not sure how knowledgeable he is of the Buddhist tradition, but he's clearly, moving away from its complex nature and how the Buddhist tradition approaches critically the potential experiences coming out of this. It's not that by meditating for X hours a day using a certain technique, you will become enlightened, or you will become a better person, or you will increase your level of well-being. It's nothing as simplistic as that. So in that respect, I think there is something which I would call intellectually dishonest, not just about him, but about quite a lot of people who are using mindfulness, using the scientific ideas to back up personal convictions or even political convictions.
Thanks.
Sorry, that was a long answer. I apologize.
Okay, Miguel, that was really fascinating. But thank you. But I'd like to just get a few more questions in if we can before 3:30. Simon Bowden is next, then Bronwyn, and then we've got one in the chat. So Simon, would you like to try and unmute your screen, and then we'll be able, that's it, we can hear you now.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'd like to say a little sort of personal story about how something to do with this has helped me, because I think it's easy to get so into the academic science that in the end, you lose the whole point of why anybody might be interested, although it's important that scientific research happens, but we're not all scientists here. So what I'd say for me is that a while ago, I was buying art books to give to a friend, and went and found this book on Chinese art and sculpture, a sort of gigantic old Pelican book from the 1950s that I could never have afforded new. And just flicking through the pages of images, black and white photographs of Buddhas and Chinese landscapes, I was struck by an extraordinary peacefulness in the images, which weren't as realistic as Western art, but were, for hundreds, the whole tradition is over a couple of thousand years, longer, but for hundreds of years, people were able to achieve images representing mental peacefulness. And as it happened, I had a friend who's quite an eminent translator of Chinese poetry. So recently, I've been reading some of this stuff, Yeah, I mean, the great era of Chinese poetry is about 700 or 800 AD, but it also goes on for thousands of years. And I also read a book about Zen, because I was aware that the Zen and Taoist tradition was important. So for me, I've been doing something where I read a bit of this ancient Chinese poetry every morning. I'm aware of some of the sort of the Zen background to it, and the Buddhist idea that, I mean, if you're a thoroughgoing Buddhist, you have this almost nutty belief that yourself doesn't exist. And I think probably that is the way to the dark side, to take these things so seriously that you wander around saying, I don't exist, I don't exist. It's this, or thing in my brain that exists. You know, therein lies nuttiness. But to achieve a much greater detachment than one normally has in one's life, and to concentrate on the here and now, and to see the way that some of these ancient Chinese poets, they're able to describe, you know, wonderful and terrible events, but with a kind of detachment, it's a, you know, the gains much outweigh the losses. And it's been very helpful for me, and for me to try to open a bit of creativity in myself as well. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. That's really, really, really very important. And I'm sorry if in any way it seemed like I was denigrating the potential of meditation in all sorts of ways. Again, these techniques, as I started out by mentioning earlier in my talk, are used across all religious traditions, and it is true that in the West, particularly in the West, which was, historically more associated with Protestant Christianity, we lost quite a lot of these contemplative techniques. It didn't happen so much in the West, which was under Orthodox and Western Christianity. Although some of the counter-Reformation within the Roman Catholic world also did away with quite a lot of the contemplative zeitgeist, which was very prevalent within the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages. So we have, so there's very good reasons why we have developed these techniques. And I think that from the moment that that human gathering started growing, I think that for most of our evolution, we've had, rather small collectives. People, we'd have 100 to 100 people living together. And our kind of interaction with others and the stress. Someone I worked with, who's a well-known evolutionary psychologist, Robin Dunbar, he likes to say that after the search for food, and water, the strongest pressure we have, the thing which is most difficult to deal with, are other people. And we have come up with a whole range of ways to regulate our behavior so that we don't kill each other or do all sorts of things, or we steal from others. So I think that the development of the world religions are clearly oriented towards the collective good. They're mindful of what needs to be done so that we're not killing each other. And it's also from those religious traditions that a more individual sense of salvation or enlightenment was derived. And I think that these more passive meditation techniques, as opposed to the more ecstatic things, which still happen in rituals. People still sing together. In some religions, they also dance. These more passive techniques do have all sorts of benefits, and you can see how they're reflected, as you're rightly saying, in some poetry and art, which sometimes try to catch a glimpse of the experiences derived from these meditation techniques. So I completely agree with you, the insight you shared, and thank you for that. I'm also looking at the chat where Peter is asking something about enlightenment. He's saying the aim of Buddhism is to achieve enlightenment. What exactly is that? Has it been pinned down? And how would one know if one is enlightened? Is it just simply stopping thinking and basic awareness of everything? Does enlightenment end when meditation ends? These are all very, very interesting questions. And
if you can give a brief answer on what is enlightenment, Miguel. We just got 2 more to get in, but yeah, a brief comment on that would be very interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, even within the Buddhist tradition, there's different understandings, but certainly enlightenment is associated with the idea of detachment or liberation from suffering and the cycle of birth and rebirth, which again comes from Hindu thinking. In that sense, I mean, Buddhism, I mean, the Buddha is inserted within a Hindu way of thinking. Now, it's very, very difficult to approach this scientifically. We don't really have either the technical tools or the conceptual tools. I mean, conceptually, we can start to think of how might a person who is not affected by suffering act. But what does this mean? Does this mean that the person does not suffer? Because on the one hand, we like to think, or sometimes it's mentioned in the text, that some people come back, although they don't have to, because they're enlightened, they come back to worldly life because they feel compassion for others who are still suffering. So although one is detached, one still is able to feel compassion for others. I think what is really important to retain is that one should not trust what psychologists are saying about this, basically, because most psychologists do not have a good grasp of the sort of discussions that are going on. This is not something straightforward. There's a couple of 3 chapters on Buddhism and meditation in this Oxford Handbook. If someone is interested, just email me and I'll send them to you, because they give you a sort of sophisticated idea, but I mean an objective one of these kinds of discussions and how enlightenment is or is not related to meditation. Because although Buddhisms do consider meditation a gateway into enlightenment, it's not just meditation that allows you to reach that state. And there's also lots of discussions about if this is something mechanistic or not. So some Buddhists would say that it's not. I mean, you can meditate and you may never be enlightened.
Okay, thank you, Miguel. We're getting a little bit short of time, so if I can ask the next 2 questions and answers to be as brief as possible. Bronwyn, we'll bring you back in, and then Steve. So that will be the last 2. Bronwyn.
Mine was not really a question. Again, it was a personal thing of my experience with Jon Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness. I was part of a programme at the Community Brain Injury Service at Poole Hospital here in Dorset, because I sustained a brain injury. And we used the mindfulness programme to put a group of those of us who had acquired brain injuries to learn the technique and to see whether using mindfulness helped us control our disability, if you like, what the brain injury had left each one of us on the course with to deal with in life. And the occupational therapist who trained as a MBSR teacher put us through the course, and we then kept the group going for 3 years thereafterwards. And everybody who stayed on the course and did it all said that they found great improvements to their daily lives and coping with acquired and severe brain injury. So perhaps you had some ideas about Jon Kabat-Zinn, and the other lady was on about it for for pain management, I can say from my experience, it was my first step into meditation and coping with life with a long-term health condition.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really important. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Steve?
Well, there's a few questions, but it's obviously I haven't got time really. But I just wanted to point out the completely opposite. I mean, I agree with the two ladies about some. I mean, I've read Jon Kabat-Zinn a lot years ago, and there was some elements of pain management that I found were quite useful. But I read his book, Mindfulness Way Through Depression, about 8 or 9 years ago when I was going through a bad period, and it was absolutely dreadful. I mean, when you got to about halfway through before it even mentioned that if you're in a state of depression at this point in time, this is not the book to be reading. There was no kind of warning beforehand. And lots of people have complained on Amazon reviews. If you look at Amazon's reviews on that book, they've all had the same sort of thing, that book was completely misstated as a mindfulness way through depression. It was almost saying that it was a mindfulness way to prevent depression coming back, but there's no clue. You know, there was no sort of sign that was suggested. So a lot of people have read that book expecting that to be helping with their depression, and they've just found it been a real waste of time, and actually probably made things worse. And it probably, and mindfulness is not very good for a lot of mental conditions, but it's just not being stated. It's very good for pain management, and I probably agree with that. So I just wondered what you know, obviously there's a dark side about, my view is that a lot of people don't really like to accept how the mind works, and our aggressions and our defense mechanisms and things that are there to help keep some sort of balance in your mental state. And mindfulness, if it's done wrong or done badly or very with somebody who doesn't really know what they're doing, there's all sorts of consequences that can come from it if you don't know what's going on.
Thank you also for sharing that. It's important to have all these views. Thank you everyone.
Okay, well, we're out of time, everyone, but Miguel, Phil has just put a note in the chat wondering if you can give us a link to the Oxford Handbook. I don't know if that's easy to do before you go.
So I'll what I will do, so the problem with the Oxford Handbook is that it's only coming out next year in print, and Oxford University Press doesn't even allow people, unless they only institutions, to access what is already online. But I'll just put in my email if you're interested in. You can see the contents, the chapters which are already online. So if you're interested in anyone, just email me and I'll be able to send that to you.
Okay. Well, Miguel, thank you so much for speaking to us this afternoon. It's been incredibly interesting. I'm sure everyone has found it really interesting. So yes, please appreciate Miguel in any way you can on Zoom. That's very kind. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you know, we can keep the conversation going on the meetup page. You can put comments and questions in the chat, and we can carry on there any time. So thank you again. Thank you all for coming along. Don't forget our winter appeal, and we will see you all again very soon. And I'll be in touch with you, Miguel, as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you're all well.
Thank you. Thank you, Miguel.
Meditating if you